Most people believe the narcissist is the one with the power, the manipulator, the controller, the person pulling all the invisible strings in the relationship. But that belief hides a deeper truth that almost no one sees until it's far too late. When a narcissist betrays a super empath, they don't win. They unknowingly destroy the one source of power they depended on more than anything else. And the strange part is this: the narcissist usually doesn't realize what they've lost until the damage is already permanent. To understand why, you first have to understand something about narcissists that is rarely explained clearly. A narcissist doesn't build their identity the way most people do. Most people build their identity from experiences, growth, mistakes, relationships, and self-reflection. But a narcissist builds their identity from something much more fragile: perception. Their sense of self depends on how others see them, how others react to them, and how much emotional influence they can maintain over the people around them. Everything becomes a performance. Conversations become stages. Relationships become systems of emotional leverage. Attention becomes oxygen, and the people in their lives slowly become the mirrors that reflect the image they want to believe about themselves. But not every mirror has the same power. Some people offer shallow attention, compliments, temporary admiration, surface-level validation. A narcissist can collect those things almost anywhere. But a super empath offers something entirely different, something far more valuable, something far more addictive. Because when a super empath cares about someone, they don't do it halfway. They invest deeply, they listen closely, they try to understand the emotions behind every action. They notice the small changes in tone, behavior, and energy that most people overlook. And when someone they care about struggles, the super empath doesn't step away. They lean closer, they try harder, they give more patience, more understanding, more chances. To a narcissist, this kind of person feels like the perfect environment for control, because the empath doesn't react the way most people would. When the narcissist creates tension, the empath tries to restore peace. When the narcissist behaves unfairly, the empath searches for the deeper reason behind it. When the narcissist withdraws emotionally, the empath attempts to reconnect and repair the bond. From the outside, this may look like loyalty or compassion, but inside the narcissist's psychological world, something else is happening. The narcissist begins to rely on this emotional stability more than they realize. The empath becomes the one who absorbs the chaos, the one who repairs the emotional damage, the one who restores balance after every storm the narcissist creates. And slowly, a hidden dependency forms. The narcissist becomes accustomed to having someone who will always try to understand them, someone who will keep showing up emotionally, even when the relationship becomes confusing or painful. This dynamic quietly feeds the narcissist's ego in a way that few other relationships ever could, because the empathist's emotional investment is genuine. It isn't superficial admiration. It isn't casual attention. It's deep emotional presence. And that presence becomes the foundation that stabilizes the narcissist's entire sense of importance. But this is where the dynamic becomes dangerously misunderstood. Because while the narcissist believes they are controlling the empath is observing everything. Super empaths don't just feel emotions. They study patterns. They listen beneath words. They notice contradictions between what someone says and what they actually do. At the beginning of the relationship, compassion often softens this awareness. The empath may notice the inconsistencies, but they interpret them through empathy. They assume the narcissist's behavior as coming from insecurity, pain, past wounds, or emotional confusion. So instead of confronting the patterns immediately, they try to help. They give patience, they give understanding. They give space for the person to improve. But during this time, something important is happening quietly beneath the surface. The empath is collecting emotional information, every broken promise, every subtle manipulation, every moment when responsibility is avoided, every shift in blame, every time affection appears only when control begins slipping away. The empath notices all of it, not with judgment at first, but with curiosity. And over time, those observations begin connecting like pieces of a puzzle. At first, the empath sees isolated incidents. Then they begin seeing repeating patterns. And eventually, those patterns form a complete picture, a picture that the narcissist never expected the empath to fully understand. But the moment of clarity rarely happens gradually. It often happens suddenly, usually triggered by one event that crosses a line the empath can no longer explain, a deep betrayal, a major lie, public humiliation, emotional manipulation that becomes impossible to ignore, or a moment when the narcissist's mask slips completely. And in that instant, something inside the empath shifts. The confusion disappears, the emotional fog clears, and all the scattered memories of past behavior suddenly align into one undeniable truth. The relationship was never what the empath believed it was. It was a system built around control. And once the empath sees the system clearly, everything changes. The narcissist expects the usual reaction. They expect anger, arguments, emotional confrontation, attempts to fix the relationship, because even negative emotions still feed the narcissist's sense of influence. But the super empath's response is different. Something far more unsettling happens. The emotional energy that once flowed toward the narcissist suddenly stops. The empath doesn't chase explanations anymore. They don't argue endlessly trying to prove the truth. They don't plead for accountability. Instead, they step back, calmly, quietly, almost silently. And to the narcissist, this silence feels disturbing in a way they cannot immediately explain. Because the empath who once tried to repair everything is no longer participating in the emotional game. The attention disappears, the reassurance disappears, the emotional reactions disappears. And with it, the narcissist loses something they depended on far more than they ever realized. Narcissistic supply. This supply is the emotional fuel that keeps the narcissist's ego functioning. It can come from admiration, praise, conflict, jealousy, or attention of any kind. But the most powerful supply often comes from someone who genuinely cares, because authentic emotional investment carries far more psychological weight than superficial attention. And the super empath provided exactly that: deep engagement, deep understanding, deep emotional response. When that disappears, the narcissist suddenly feels a strange emotional vacuum. They may try to replace it quickly. New people, new admiration, new attention. But something feels different, because those new sources rarely offer the same depth of emotional connection the empath once gave so freely. And there is another reason the loss becomes so destabilizing. The super empath often understands the narcissist better than almost anyone else ever has. During the relationship, the empath spent countless moments analyzing conversations, studying emotional reactions, trying to decode the confusing behavior that kept appearing again and again. They learned the narcissist's patterns, how they redirect blame, how they create emotional confusion, how they withdraw affection when they want control, how they suddenly return with charm when they sense someone pulling away. When the empath finally steps back, they carry all that knowledge with them. The narcissist realizes something uncomfortable. The person who once believed their illusion now sees through it completely. And that awareness cannot easily be undone, because the empath is no longer reacting from emotional vulnerability. They are reacting from clarity. The narcissist may try familiar strategies to regain control: charm, apologies, promises of change, sudden displays of vulnerability, or even attempts to provoke jealousy or guilt. But something feels different this time. The empathy's responses remain steady, calm, detached, almost immune to the emotional triggers that once worked so reliably. And for the narcissist, this creates a deeply unsettling experience. For perhaps the first time in the relationship, they cannot influence the emotional direction anymore. Their usual tools stop working. The emotional reactions they depend on simply don't appear, and this leads to something narcissists try to avoid their entire lives: a crack in their ego, not necessarily the kind of self-reflection that leads to growth, but an uncomfortable awareness that someone who once cared deeply has chosen to walk away permanently. The narcissist may respond defensively. They might rewrite the story, portray themselves as the victim, blame the math for the relationship failing, or attempt to convince others that the empath was the problem all along. These reactions protect the fragile identity the narcissist works so hard to maintain. But beneath those defenses, the loss still exists. Because deep down, the narcissist understands something they cannot easily admit. The person who understood them most clearly is no longer under their influence, and that realization threatens the very illusion of control their identity depends on. Meanwhile, something remarkable happens on the other side of the dynamic. The super empath begins transforming. For a long time, their emotional energy was focused on understanding and helping the narcissist. Now that energy begins returning to where it should have always been, toward themselves. The empathy that once tried to heal someone else begins healing their own emotional boundaries. They start recognizing behaviors they once tolerated. They begin protecting their peace. They learn to trust their intuition again. And perhaps most importantly, they stop confusing compassion with self-sacrifice. This transformation is something the narcissist struggles to comprehend, because the empath who once gave endless chances has become someone entirely different. Not colder, not cruel, but clearer, stronger, unreachable by the manipulative patterns that once worked so easily. And this leads to the final shift in the entire dynamic. The narcissist loses control permanent. Control was never just a preference for them. It was the foundation of their emotional world. As long as someone remained emotionally reactive, they believed they still held power in the relationship. But when the super empath fully disengages, that foundation collapses. The narcissist can attempt charm, anger, guilt, kindness, manipulation, but none of it restores the old dynamic, because the empath has already stepped beyond it, and once someone truly sees the game, they can never return to playing it the same way again. In the end, the narcissist doesn't just lose a relationship. They lose the illusion that sustained their sense of control, and that illusion is far more difficult to replace than they ever expected. Meanwhile, the super empath walks forward with something far more valuable than revenge or validation: clarity, strength, and a deeper understanding of their own emotional power. Because the greatest shift in this entire story is not the narcissist losing control. It's the empath realizing they never needed to give it away in the first place. But the story doesn't truly end the moment the empath walks away. In many ways, that's when the most revealing part of the entire dynamic begins, because the narcissist doesn't immediately accept what has happened. At first, they interpret the empath's distance as something temporary, a phase, a reaction that will fade once emotions cool down. After all, throughout the entire relationship, every conflict followed a familiar cycle, would create tension. The empath would feel the emotional weight of it, and eventually the empath would return trying to repair what had broken. trying to repair what had broken. So when the empath finally pulls away with calm silence instead of emotional pursuit, the narcissist assumes the same pattern will repeat. They believe the empath will eventually come back, apologize, explain, or at the very least react. But something different is happening this time. Days pass, then weeks, and the empath's silence remains steady. Not cold, not dramatic, just peaceful distance. And this kind of silence feels deeply uncomfortable to a narcissist because it offers them nothing to manipulate. There is no anger to provoke, no emotional argument to twist, no desperate attempts to fix the relationship that they can exploit for control. For the first time, the narcissist finds themselves in a situation where the usual psychological levers simply do not exist. So they try something else. They reappear with charm. Suddenly the tone becomes warm again. They may send a message filled with nostalgia, reminding the empath of good memories from the past. They might speak about how special the connection once felt, how rare it was, how misunderstood they have been by everyone except the empath. And for a moment this approach sometimes works on people who are still emotionally entangled. But a super empath who has reached clarity responds differently. They don't rush back into the emotional current. They observe, they listen, and they notice something important. The charm is not followed by accountability. The apology is not followed by change. The vulnerability feels strangely familiar, like a script that has appeared before during other moments when the narcissist feared losing control. This recognition becomes the empath's greatest protection, because once someone understands a manipulation pattern, it loses its power, and when the narcissist realizes that charm is no longer effective, their behavior often shifts again. The warmth fades, frustration appears. Suddenly the tone becomes defensive. They may accuse the empath of overreacting. They might suggest the empath misunderstood the situation. They might even attempt to make the empath feel guilty for creating distance. But none of these strategies recreate the old dynamic, because the empath is no longer responding from emotional confusion. They are responding from awareness, and awareness changes everything. At this point, something unexpected begins happening inside the narcissist's world. Without the empath acting as the emotional stabilizer, the narcissist begins feeling the instability that the empath once quietly absorbed. Every relationship the narcissist forms starts showing the same repeating patterns. The charm at the beginning, the gradual shift toward control, the tension, the emotional gains. But the difference now is that the narcissist no longer has someone who understood them deeply enough to manage the emotional chaos they create. New people may admire them temporarily. They may provide attention or validation. But these connections lack the emotional depth the super empath once offered. The narcissist senses the difference even if they cannot clearly explain it. Something feels missing. The conversations feel shallower. The attention feels weaker. The emotional influence doesn't last as long. Because what the narcissist lost was not just admiration. They lost someone who invested genuine emotional intelligence into the relationship. Someone who paid attention to their moods, their insecurities, their subtle signals. Someone who tried to stabilize their emotional storms instead of abandoning the connection the moment things became complicated. And while the narcissist may pretend the loss doesn't matter, the psychological impact quietly remains. Meanwhile, on the other side of the story, the empath is experiencing something equally powerful, but in the opposite direction. For a long time, their emotional energy revolved around understanding someone else, trying to decode their behavior, trying to repair a relationship that constantly drifted into confusion. Now that energy begins returning to its rightful place. The empath begins reflecting on their own experiences. They start noticing things they once ignored, moments when their intuition warned them something was wrong. moments when their boundaries were slowly pushed further than they ever intended, moments when they apologized for things that were never truly their responsibility. This reflection is not about regret, it's about awakening, because the empath begins recognizing a deeper truth about themselves. Their compassion was never weakness, their patience was never foolishness. Those qualities were strength, but they were given to someone who treated them as tools for control instead of gifts of connection. And once the empath understands this, their perspective on relationships begins to change. They no longer confuse intensity with authenticity. They no longer mistake emotional chaos for passion. They begin valuing peace, consistency, emotional responsibility. And this transformation creates something that narcissists find extremely difficult to accept. The empath who once tolerated manipulation has become someone who recognizes it immediately. The empath who once searched for reasons to stay now trusts their instinct when something feels wrong. And the empath who once poured endless energy into fixing others now protects their emotional space carefully. This change is quiet but powerful, because it means the empath has stepped out of the psychological role the narcissist relied on, and once someone leaves that role, the entire dynamic collapses. But there is another layer to this story that many people overlook. Narcissists often believe they can return later and restore the connection whenever they choose. They assume time will soften the empath's boundaries. They believe nostalgia will eventually reopen the emotional door. Months may pass, sometimes even years, and the narcissists may attempt to reappear once again. The message might sound casual, almost friendly, as if nothing significant ever happened. They may test the waters with a simple greeting or a light conversation, because in their mind, the connection was never truly lost. Was only paused, but what they encounter instead is something they never anticipated. The empathy they once knew no longer exists in the same form. The person they once manipulated has grown. Their energy feels different. Their emotional responses are balanced and calm. The narcissist's familiar strategies feel strangely ineffective, and that realization can be deeply frustrating for someone who built their identity around emotional influence. Because the empath is no longer searching for validation from the narcissist. They are no longer trying to repair the past. They are simply living beyond it. And this is the moment when the narcissist finally understands something they resisted for a very long time. The control they believed they had was never permanent. It existed only because the empath cared enough to keep participating in the relationship. Once that participation ended, the illusion of control disappeared with it. And illusions once broken are almost impossible to rebuild in the same way again. But the most important lesson in this entire story does not belong to the narcissist. It belongs to the empath. Because what began as a painful betrayal ultimately becomes a turning point in their emotional life. The empath learns something that changes the way they approach every future relationship. They learn that compassion must exist alongside boundaries. That understanding someone's pain does not mean accepting their harmful behavior. That love without respect slowly erodes the soul. And perhaps most importantly, they learn to trust the quiet voice inside them that noticed the truth long before the mind was ready to accept it. Once an empath reaches this level of awareness, they become something incredibly powerful. Not hardened, not closed off, but emotionally intelligent in a way that protects their peace. They still care deeply, they still connect sincerely, but they no longer ignore the patterns that once trapped them, exhausting emotional cycles. And because of that growth, the next relationships they form look very different. They seek balance instead of intensity, mutual effort instead of emotional imbalance, honesty instead of psychological gains. Meanwhile, the narcissist continues searching for reflections of admiration, that feel as powerful as the one they lost. But authentic emotional depth cannot be easily replaced, because genuine connection requires vulnerability, accountability, and empathy. And those are the very things narcissists struggle to sustain. In the end, the betrayal that once felt like the end of the story becomes the beginning of a transformation. The narcissist loses the emotional mirror that once protected their illusion of power, but the empath gains something far more valuable: clarity about their own worth, clarity about their emotional boundaries, and clarity about the kind of love that truly deserves their energy. And once someone reaches that level of clarity, they don't just walk away from toxic dynamics. They become completely unreachable to them, not because they built walls, but because they finally learned how to recognize the difference between someone who wants connection and someone who only wanted control. And once someone reaches that level of clarity, something subtle but powerful begins to shape the rest of their life. Because awareness does more than help a person escape one toxic relationship. It quietly rewires how they see people, how they interpret behavior, and how quickly they recognize emotional patterns that once took months or years to understand. At first, this shift can feel strange to the empath. They may notice that certain conversations now trigger quiet alarms inside their mind. Small inconsistencies that once would have been brushed aside suddenly feel obvious. Words that don't match actions stand out clearly. Where they once searched for explanations, they now simply observe. Where they once gave endless benefit of the doubt, they now allow reality to speak for itself. This does not make them cynical, it makes them discerning, and that distinction becomes incredibly important. Because the empath begins to understand something that many people never learn until much later in life. Not everyone deserves unlimited emotional access to them. For a long time, the empath believed love meant patience at any cost. They believed that understanding someone deeply meant staying through every emotional storm. But experience teaches a different lesson. Real connection does not require constant emotional repair. Real connection does not force one person to carry the weight of another's unresolved chaos. Real connection does not rely on confusion, manipulation, or cycles of hurt, followed by temporary affection. Once the empath sees that clearly, their entire approach to relationships becomes healthier and stronger. They begin choosing people who communicate openly, people who take responsibility for their behavior, people who do not see vulnerability as something to exploit, but something to respect. And because the empath now moves through the world with stronger emotional boundaries, they also become far less interesting to narcissistic personalities. Manipulators are naturally drawn to those who give endlessly without protecting themselves. But when an empath begins valuing their peace, their time, and their emotional energy, those same manipulators quickly sense that the old tactics will not work. The emotional door they once walked through so easily is now closed, not slammed shut in anger, but simply no longer available. And this is where the final bus formation of the empath becomes clear. They no longer feel the need to prove their worth to anyone. They no longer chase understanding from people who refuse to give it. They no longer exhaust themselves trying to decode behavior that consistently brings confusion. Instead, they invest their energy where it naturally flows back, where respect is mutual,